Considering the cost of the Roland Jupiter-X and the relative affordability of Zenology Pro inside Roland Cloud, is buying the hardware synthesizer really worth the money? Well, that's the topic we're going to explore in today's video. So, in my last video, someone asked if the Roland Jupiter-X is really worth the money, and they commented that it bothers him that you can get the same sounds with Zenology Pro at a much lower price point, raising the question, why bother buying the expensive hardware at all? And look, those are valid questions to ask, but I don't think that there's a one-size-fits-all answer for everyone. I'm sure this video won't convince you which platform is better, and to be honest, that's really not my goal. See, in my case, I do actually use both. I think Zenology Pro and the Jupiter-X each have their place, and both tools are, quote unquote, worth it. Now that said, in today's video, we're going to be taking a look at these Roland synth platforms and talk about what makes both of these tools worth actually having in the proverbial toolbox. Because as the saying goes, when all you have is a hammer, everything starts to look like a nail. So the way I see it, the more tools, the better. First, Zenology Pro, a software synthesizer built on the Zen Core engine, and it's the same technology that runs the Jupiter-X, as well as the Roland Phantom, the MC707, and of course other products in the current Roland lineup. It's available from Roland Cloud, and it costs about $229 for a lifetime key, or through a monthly subscription starting at just $9.99. And you can also get an unlimited subscription for about $20 a month, and that will get you access to everything available in the Roland Cloud, which is an option that I personally go with. And yeah, I know for some people, they are vehemently against paying for software as a subscription, which is probably a topic for a different video, but suffice to say, I don't mind it. That said, how does it sound? Being as Zenology Pro uses the same Zen Core synthesis engine as some of Roland's other flagship hardware synths, you'd expect it to sound pretty good, and of course, in my opinion, I think it does. So here's an example of a synth pad tone using the Jupiter 8 model with no edits other than a little bit of filter tweaking. So while that sounds all well and good, what exactly is Zenology Pro? Well, it's a software synth that uses 4 partials per tone architecture. It comes loaded with 1,800 waveforms, and I think you can expand it up to 7,000. It does VA modeling with multiple filter types. It includes 90 Roland effects, and you can load model expansion emulations of the classics like the Jupiter 8, the Juno 106, JX8P, SH101, and the just released JD800. Now, additionally, it can be used as a tone editor of sorts for Roland hardware that also runs on the Zen Core platform, such as the Jupiter-X and the XM. Any tone that you create in the Zenology app can be exported to your hardware synths, which is, I think, a cool feature, but it's certainly not a full-fledged editor for the hardware synths, which is something that we will go into a little bit deeper later on in the video. Now, on the other hand, we have the Roland Jupiter-X and, of course, the XM, which are hardware implementations of the Zen Core synthesis engine, with an emphasis, I guess you would say, on the analog model emulations, at least in terms of the visual presentation, the design, and the UI. Now, the Zen Core engine, and by extension the Jupiter-X, is built on Roland's ABM, or Analog Behavior Modeling Technology, which is a departure from their prior generation ACB, or Analog Circuit Behavior-based software. Both have their pros and cons, with the older ACB being probably a bit more accurate in representing the sounds that it's modeling, but being more resource intensive. The newer ABM system gives more polyphony and features while still maintaining very good sonic characteristics, which perhaps won't be an absolutely perfect representation of the sounds that it's modeling, but it provides a good deal more in terms of flexibility and functionality. So I think that illustrates fairly well, despite my somewhat mediocre playing, something that sets the Jupiter-X apart from Zenology Pro. That is that it's really easy to do big, layered split sounds with the Jupiter, and you can get some huge, epic tones out of this synth. Now sure, of course, you could load up multiple instances of Zenology in your DAW, and you could achieve the exact same effect, but at least for me, there's a certain immediacy to working on the hardware that gets you the effect really quickly, and I kind of prefer that. You just select the tones that you want on each part, split and layer those parts, set up some multi-effect parameters, and you're off to the races. Now it comes down to what workflow you prefer, of course, but sometimes getting my face out of the computer and having a more hands-on approach is appealing, so this works for me. That said, you can get some pretty epic sounds out of Zenology without any layering, just by dialing up something like this synth pluck patch from the Jupiter 8 model. Now in the pros versus cons debate, a huge pro for Zenology, at least for me, is cost, and at $10 a month, it really is a no-brainer. I use it despite having a Jupiter-X because it's affordable, and at times it is actually really convenient, especially if you're on the go and you're working off a laptop away from your hardware synths. And while I do really like sitting in front of my Jupiter and working with it, in a scenario like that, it's nice to toss an instance of Zenology Pro on a track, open up the patch list, filter for something like a synth bass, and start writing music pretty much immediately. Now, yes, I did mention the cost of Zenology Pro as being a positive thing, and I know a lot of you guys despise subscription-based software as a service price models, and I get it, but to each their own. I got over this a long time ago. In a lot of ways, I find price models like this preferable. Just like I do with my digital media consumption, like, Netflix, I'll turn on Roland Cloud for a month or two when I want to use it, and then I'll turn it off when I'm done and I don't want to use it anymore. I consume it as needed, and I don't feel the need to own a physical license to my software any more than I feel the need to own a physical copy of a movie or a show that I'm watching on Netflix. So for me, this model works, but I know it's not for everyone. That said, on the plus side, you can buy lifetime keys for Zenology Pro if you want to own it. So a common negative that I've heard in regards to the Jupiter-X is that it is complicated and confusing, and I suppose to a certain extent that is true. The Zen Core synth engine is an extremely feature-rich platform, and to get everything you possibly can out of it, you gotta dig pretty deep. Now, fortunately, if you want to get deep into editing Zen Core patches, you can do this on your computer with the Zenology plugin and export those tones to your hardware. However, when it comes to doing the basic stuff, the Jupiter-X interface isn't really complicated at all. When it comes to editing the Jupiter-8 and the Juno 106 models, I'd say that the majority of what you need to do is right on the front panel. For example, I wanted to make a split scene with a punchy Juno 106 bass on the lower half of the keyboard and a Jupiter-8 brass tone on the upper half. Within a minute or so, I had what I was looking for. Now, I could go ahead and start playing the patch just like that, or even use my DAW to sequence what I had in mind, and that would be all well and good. But because the Jupiter-X can have up to 5 parts, and one of those being a drum section, and of course that it has the iArpeggiator built in, I thought, why not add a beat and put an ARP pattern on the bass tone? I like doing this as it makes for a great tool to start coming up with ideas without the need to move over to the computer and work there. So here we jump into the menus, and a few clicks later, we are right on our way. So yeah, setting up scenes and picking tones as well as tweaking those tones and the iArp is pretty easy, especially if you're using patches from the model expansions like the Jupiter and the Juno. You just need to get a basic understanding of how the scenes and parts are structured, which you should be able to get under your belt in like less than an hour of playing around with the synth. It's all about how you approach it, and it kind of reminds me of a review video that I saw from the synth guy over at Anderton's, where he was really frustrated with the Jupiter-X. He was scrolling through scenes and then he would, grab the cutoff knob and it wouldn't do what he was expecting. He just didn't really understand the structure of the synth. Everything on the synth is in a scene, and scenes can have 4 different synth tone parts. And the knobs and sliders are only going to affect the part that you have selected. So if you have a lead tone on part 1 and a pad tone on part 2, you can't filter the pad tone if you have the lead tone selected. You can, however, select one or the other, or even both, and then start tweaking the sound. Think of it sort of like you have a keyboard controller routed out to 4 separate desktop synth modules. You have to be aware of which module is active when you're working with so many moving parts, and honestly, that part of the synth is pretty easy to understand. Now here's a patch from Zenology Pro using the Jupiter-8 model, and the patch is called Sunbeams. Now obviously this patch sounds great, but what I want you to take a look at is the interface. It's actually pretty succinct. There's not all that many parameters to mess with in the Jupiter-8 model, and the vast majority of what you see here is also available right on the front panel of the Jupiter-X. So whether you want to edit patches on Zenology, possibly even exporting them to your synth, or if you want to do it from the Jupiter-X interface, it's really pretty simple when dealing with those synth models, the expansion models. There's not an overwhelming number of parameters to deal with and not much menu diving either. However, there is a caveat, and that's that creating and editing patches that use the PCM-based 4-partial Zen Core engine does get a little trickier. The base Zen Core engine has a lot more going on with it than the Jupiter or the Juno models. So in that case, I would almost always work on the Zenology Pro app and then export the patch to my keyboard. Now, all that said, I still do wish that there was a full-featured editor and librarian tool for the computer. Why is that? Because editing tones or patches on Zenology doesn't create a scene file for you to export to the Jupiter-X. If we look at an overview of the Jupiter-X architecture, you can see that within the scene you have the settings for IARP, the 4 tone parts, and the drum part, and each tone can have MFX settings along with a scene setting for delay, reverb, chorus, and drive. And then there are some system settings as well. But when you're editing tones in Zenology, you are dealing with one single tone part at a time with no control over settings for the arpeggiator, the scene effects, or the keyboard controllers. Now, it would be nice if you had an editor that managed all those settings and offered a way of organizing your tones and scenes. You have to remember on the Jupiter, everything is part of a scene. Even if you're only using one single tone, it's still part of a scene with the other 3 parts and the drums muted. But that's a good thing. That's why there's such a great ability to be able to build some huge layered sounds that wouldn't be possible with Zenology Pro alone, of course, unless you created multiple instances of the plugin within your DAW and mixed and layered them manually. Now, another factor in favor of the Jupiter-X is that it's an outstanding and solidly built piece of hardware with a great keyboard that frankly feels fantastic. Now, for some people, the built-in speakers for the X and the XM hardware is another probably appreciated feature. And of course, the control surface is super high quality as well. It is just overall a really high quality piece of hardware, and it's an instrument that I expect that I'll own for years and years to come. Now, if I'm thinking about it, I mean, if I'm just going to strictly use software like Zenology, I'm not sure what a comparable keyboard controller for the computer would cost, because I have used a few ranging up in price of several $100s, and honestly, none of them had the feel or the quality of build that the Jupiter-X has. That said, depending on your workflow, you might prefer the software over the physical piece of hardware, whether you're in the studio or on the go. And like I said, sometimes I do load up Zenology and use it in situations or if the need comes up. And for the price, you really can't beat it. But there's something about having that keyboard sitting in front of me, tweaking the knobs and the sliders, turning on the arpeggiator, and just playing around with whatever ideas floating around inside my head at the time. Now, I don't think that all of that answered the question, is the Jupiter-X really worth it, in so much as how it compares to Zenology? But, like I said, that wasn't really my goal in this video. In my opinion, I think they're both great tools, and that they are both worth having. Yes, you absolutely can get the same great sounds out of both platforms, and of course, Zenology Pro is a lot cheaper. But the Jupiter-X has something special about it that I just really like. Now, I guess either way, you really can't go wrong, so get whichever one works best for you, or like me, get them both.